I've talked before about our need to study the Constitution for ourselves. Well, I came across a story a couple of months ago that shows not only the tyranny of red flag style laws, but it also explains why every one of us should read and study the Constitution for ourselves. So we'll discuss that next on the Constitution Study.
Every day, we're everyday Americans. Hold our own and call it home. Put it all on a little piece of land. Pay the bills, stay out of jail, love the neighbors and have a few good friends. Every day, we're everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here with the Constitution Study, where we read and study the Constitution and we teach the rising generation to be free. I'm glad you could join me today. As always, I'm going to point you to the website, constitutionstudy.com. I'm in the middle of spinning up some new software, some new services to be available on the website. So keep an eye on what's going on there. It's been a little tricky. As usual, it seems like the government likes to get in our way. But keep an eye out. There's now an online store, and hopefully some new classes will be spinning up pretty quickly. As always, I want to thank everybody that helps me, whether it's Rebel North Band and letting me use their music, to the people that share this message, to you, not only who read and share this message, but who comment, who ask questions, who are really digging, trying to find the answers to what the Constitution actually says and what it actually means. The protagonist of our story is a man by the name of Mr. Nichols. He's 84 years old, lives in Tisbury, Massachusetts. Now, Mr. Nichols is a Korean War vet with a 6-decade career with the Tisbury Police Force. Now he continues to serve his community by acting as a crossing guard at the Tisbury School. While dining at a local restaurant, Mr. Nichols told a friend he was concerned. See, the school's resource officer was going to a local convenience store to get coffee while the children were coming into school in the morning. Now, Mr. Nichols expressed concern that someone could, quote-unquote, shoot up the school in the officer's absence, which he described as leaving his post. Now, this conversation was overheard by a waitress, which is where the story gets interesting. See, the waitress made a complaint to the Tisbury police about what she'd overheard. Now, based on that, and apparently solely on that, 2 officers of the Tisbury Police Department relieved Mr. Nichols of his crossing guard duties, drove him home, and took away both his firearms and his firearm license. Now, according to Mr. Nichols, one of the officers told him what he said was a felony. However, Mr. Nichols was never charged. So what does this have to do with studying the Constitution? Well, remember my quote from John Jay that I use everywhere in the study. Every member of the state ought diligently to read and study the Constitution of his country and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. Now, this quote is one of the founding principles of the Constitution Study, and he explains we should all read and study the Constitution to know our rights. He then goes on to list 2 outcomes from this knowledge, both of which are lessons we can apply to this situation. I'm sure most of us can recognize at least 1 or 2 of Mr. Nichols' rights that were violated during this incident. But by studying the Constitution, I bet you we can see several more. Yes, Mr. Nichols' right to keep and bear arms, protected by both the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Article 17 of the Massachusetts Constitution, were violated. See, without even being charged with a crime, the city of Tisbury, and by extension the state of Massachusetts, has violated Mr. Nichols' rights. Unfortunately, there are more violations. You see, Mr. Nichols was relieved of his position as a crossing guard, his firearm license, and his property without conviction of a crime. Now, these actions deprived him of both his liberty and his property without due process of law. This is protected by the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Article 12 of the Massachusetts Constitution. The police officers confiscated property without a warrant or any exigent circumstance that would preclude getting a warrant. Rights that are also protected by the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Article 14 of the Massachusetts Constitution. In fact, the officers did not have sufficient evidence to get a valid warrant since no probable cause was demonstrated and there was no support by oath or affirmation as required by both the U.S. and Massachusetts Constitution. Now, all of this stemmed from a conversation overheard by a waitress, a bystander, a clear violation of Mr. Nichols' freedom of speech. Now, since this was based on state law, this was not a violation of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and I'll put a link to an article I wrote describing why. It was a violation of the Massachusetts Constitution, Article 21 to be specific. So how many of these rights did you think of when I described the story at the beginning of this episode? See, unless you have taken the time to study the Constitution, probably not all of them. Meanwhile, with all of these violations, what was Mr. Nichols to do? See, part of the problem with not studying the Constitution and not knowing our rights is that we're not prepared to defend and assert them. We don't take the time to think, what would I do in this situation? What could Mr. Nichols have done to defend his rights? Well, once relieved of his duties as a crossing guard, Mr. Nichols could have volunteered to leave the premises, but not go with the police unless they were taking him into custody. He could have asked to see their warrant before going with the police, allowing them into his house or searching and seizing his property. He could have asked the police for probable cause or the exigent circumstance necessary for them to search and seize both him and his property without a warrant. He could have demanded to speak with an attorney. Now, this is important. I am not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice. This comes from an understanding of how the Constitution is designed to protect the rights of everyday Americans. I also, and I can't emphasize this enough, would not recommend anyone resist any law enforcement officer. I'll repeat that because it's important. I would not recommend anyone ever resist any law enforcement officer. They are trained that they cannot lose control of a situation. So resisting only escalates the situation, and it actually degrades any evidence of the violation of your rights. However, asserting your rights, well, it does give you evidence for any criminal or civil action that may follow. You see, an officer cannot claim that they had your permission to enter your premises if you're standing in the doorway asking for their warrant and they push you out of the way. And of course, the more witnesses, the better. And since we live in a society where almost everybody has a phone with a camera on it, evidence can be easily gathered. So why did I bring up this story? Well, it should be a warning to all of us. You see, unless we study the Constitution, unless we know what our rights are, and we actually prepare to defend them and to assert them, our liberty will be at the whim of any government official that wishes to infringe on them. See, it's not resisting an officer nor an admission of guilt to invoke your rights. You should not resist an officer, but neither should you assist them in violating your rights. If we are not willing to defend and assert our rights, who will? See, are you willing to trust that any government that might be elected will never violate your rights? If so, this story should help dispel you of that myth. So, what do you think? What would you have done if you were in Mr. Nichols' position? Have you even taken the time to think, what would I do if a police officer came up and wanted to take me home? If a government agent wanted to enter your premises or wanted to search or seize any of your property, have you stopped to think what you would do? Now, I've taken some time and I've talked to my family to let them know this is what you do. You know, you ask them for a warrant, you need probable cause, exigent circumstances, and you never, ever, ever resist. You don't have to let them in your door. But that's because we spent the time to know our rights, which is what we're trying to do here. Now, I get a lot of comments and questions that may disagree with some of the things I say, but let's understand, we're here to know and understand our rights and to prepare ourselves to defend and assert them. So I would recommend that you take a little bit of time and you read through the article. I'll put a link in the description, that you Ask yourself, what would you have done in that situation? That you start thinking about that and preparing for a day that I pray never happens, but it's much better for you to be prepared for it and have it never happen than for it to happen to you unprepared. Now, as I understand it, Mr. Nichols has gotten his job as a crossing guard back, but he has not yet received his firearms or his firearms license, and his rights have not fully been restored. So think about that. Head over to the website, constitutionstudy.com. Again, keep up. I'm trying to do a lot of stuff through the end of the year that I'm hoping you will enjoy. Please comment. Please ask questions. Please let me know what you think. If you can support the Constitution Study by sharing these messages, by purchasing some of my products, just by donating to the cause, I would appreciate it greatly. It helps me continue to do this type of work, to put out this type of content. Most of all, I hope you got some information from this episode so that it'll entice you to come back so I can see you the next time on the Constitution Study.
You have to know wherever you make your stand.